Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. We're just going to give it 2 more minutes and then we'll get started. Welcome. Thanks for everyone who's joined so far. We're just going to give it another minute. We can see there's a lot of people just signing in right now. Thanks. Okay, why don't we get started? Welcome, everyone. And Maria, if you want to put on our slides. It's nice to have you join us for the webinar, Climate Messaging That Works, talking energy transition and climate change in Canada. I'm Kara Pike with Climate Access, and on behalf of Climate Access and the Climate Narratives Project, we're very happy to share this message framing guidance with you. There will be a playbook coming out shortly that summarizes this, so it's great to have you here to share in advance of that. Climate Access is based in the US, but I'm based in British Columbia, Canada, and joining you today from the traditional and unceded territories of Cowichan First Nation. And I'm excited to have my colleagues from the Climate Narratives Initiative, Maria Granados and Amber Bennett, with me today, and we'll be co-presenting the work with together. And I also just want to mention Chris Hatch, who helped write the playbook, but couldn't join us today. We're super grateful for his work. The playbook will be available on climateaccess.org. We've had lots of folks sign up for this, a real range of people from climate and environmental advocates to health, Indigenous, youth and government leaders, academics and funders. So I welcome you all to introduce yourselves in the chat, your name, affiliation, and if you want to share where you're joining from, that's great too. So we welcome that. It's kind of fun for everyone to see who all is on the webinar today. And I want to thank the Clean Economy Fund and for their support, and Joanna Leffler in particular for supporting this work. She's been a real champion, helping bring funding in and shape the efforts that we've been engaging in over the last year and a half. And we're excited to say that we're setting up a new Canadian organization to really focus on climate communication capacity building and effectiveness at the University of Winnipeg. And that's again been great thanks to Joanna for her efforts there. And we're fundraising for that effort, so we welcome your input and ideas on that as well. So for today, what we're going to do is share with you a roll-up of what we've learned from a whole number of efforts we've been engaged in over the past year. So we're drawing from the polling analysis that we put together, an analysis of the national media conversation, social listening analysis, as well as message testing that we conducted. And that will all be rolled up for you today. So we're going to try and do some sense making of all the different pieces. What does it all add up to? But most importantly, to share with you the message triangle that we've developed to help guide you on communicating about the energy transition and climate change in Canada. So that's our plan for today. Maria is going to kick things off, and then turn it over to Amber. And I just want to mention that we would welcome your questions throughout the presentation in the Q&A. We're in the webinar mode for Zoom, so that's why you don't see everyone's videos. But do please post questions in the Q&A. We'll all be tracking that. And if we don't get to them all, we'll follow up with you after the fact. In addition to introducing yourself in the chat, your affiliation, if you care to, where you're joining us from, also feel free to share resources and ideas with one another in the chat as we go through. So thanks again for joining, and Maria, over to you.
All right, so hi everybody, my name is Maria Granados. I work with the Climate Narratives Initiative, and I work really closely with Kara and Chris, like Kara mentioned in the introductions. I helped out with a lot of the research for the reports that I've pasted in the chat here, but I wanted to provide some context that we use to create the framework that we're sharing today. So like Kara mentioned, the recommendations are based on a series of message testing from social media, reviewing public opinion surveys, and researching media narratives in Canada. So to get started, what is the good news? So the good news is that most Canadians understand that climate change is a big problem and they're seriously worried about it. Amber, you can change the slide here. And then in terms of the energy transition, people definitely believe that there is an energy transition happening and it's inevitable, whether we like it or not. Support for clean energy is very high, and that's true across all demographics and regions. And the good news is that these attitudes were not wiped out by the pandemic. So even though COVID and the economy are top of mind for Canadians this year, most people support building back with a transformative agenda, and they support helping workers transition to a net zero economy. So the other piece of good news is not only is the public on board, but the media is also covering climate and the energy transition. So when we released our media analysis earlier this summer, we found that 79% of stories were pro-climate action, including 22% of stories that were covering the energy transition. So we had a question come in from Patricia Lane from Raising Impact, who I see is on the call with us today. She sent in this question prior to the webinar. So she was wondering what has changed over the last year. There was a really great Abacus poll from September of this year that showed differences in climate opinion for the last 6 years, actually. So we get a better picture of what's changed. And they found there was an 8-point increase in Canadians believing that there is conclusive evidence that the Earth is warming. So that went from 29% in 2015 to 37% in 2021. They also found that more Canadians believe that climate change is human caused. So what this means is overall acknowledgement of the issue and literacy has increased in the last 6 years, and public demand for climate action remains relatively high. So about 2/3 of Canadians want the government to do more on climate. There's other polling that also shows that concern about climate change has increased as a result of the extreme weather events that we saw this year. So this has really brought to light the impacts of climate change. And I'll pop in some of these polls in the chat so that you can reference them for yourself. And then we'll go over to the next section here. So that was the good news. The bad news is the public is still not clear about the major consequences, the threats, or the path forward. But because I hate to be the bearer of bad news, I'm going to pass it on to Amber, who will lead us through some of the challenges, but we'll also cover the solutions and opportunities and how to overcome these barriers pretty soon. So Amber, I'll pass it on to you.
Thanks, Maria. Again, I would encourage you to take a look at the public opinion roll-up that we published earlier this year. It covers a lot of this material in much more in depth. It gives you lots of juicy additional sources to take a look at. But really, we consistently see 3 obstacles to engagement in Canada, but also this rings true in many other English-speaking countries around the world. And they've been persistent for, at least a decade. And those include proximity, literacy, efficacy, and irrelevance. And so this kind of literacy and proximity piece is around understanding and understanding the, the personal impacts to us. Efficacy is around, what you can do about it, your belief around what you can do about it, and what leaders and governments can do. And then the third piece is around irrelevance. So how does this meaningfully relate to the things that I care about and to the people I care about? So if we're to take a look just briefly through the literacy piece, we know that most Canadians still do not understand what causes climate change. And so it's really not no wonder that they're unclear about what to do about it. The ozone holes continues to be referenced as part of the climate change concept, and a lot of the solutions that are referenced still include recycling plastic straws or kind of something somewhere in that environmental bucket. And very few people can independently name a climate policy. So whether that's related to gasoline vehicles or phasing out of fossil fuels. The other part of that kind of understanding piece is around proximity. And so this is kind of in flux, and we can see that recent events, say for example, in flooding in BC or heat waves, et cetera, tend to have some impact on those people who have been impacted. But by and large, people are not making a connection between the extreme weather events and other types of concerns that they might have or other parts of their lives. They continue to put them more in an environmental bucket. So extreme weather has impacts on the environment, on ecosystems, on weather, coastlines, that kind of thing. They're not necessarily making that connection to livelihoods, to their communities, to their health, kind of those social or economic parts of their lives. We also see that the Canadian public doesn't see this necessarily as urgent. So more than 2/3 of Canadians put the impacts of climate change in the future and to other people. And so, we see that people are relatively removed from both climate change still and the energy transition in particular. So the next obstacle is around efficacy. So what is we personally can do or what governments can do. So most Canadians, 60% think that even if governments try, they won't be able to reduce emissions. And half believe that we're past the point of no return, or that they're unsure about it. So the public isn't largely convinced that climate change will be addressed at the pace and the scale required. Why does this matter? Because that sense of efficacy is really related to kind of other obstacles that we see. Apathy, ambivalence, and it allows us to kind of exist in this cake and eat it too mindset. And we see that kind of in a split between both wanting to build out clean energy, but then half of the population also wanting to continue to build out oil and gas infrastructure. We see it in our personal lives where we want action, but we're not necessarily willing to support specific policies. And because we don't have that understanding and we don't necessarily know what we can do, we're unclear about the actions that we should be expecting from leaders and that we should be taking in our own lives. So for many, the pathway forward is still unclear. And this kind of leads us to the final one, which is a communications challenge in many ways. This lack of understanding and efficacy has really led us to the final obstacle, which is irrelevance. For most people, we know that people filter information through their sense of identity, through their worldviews, through people who are like them, who they see as their kind of in-group or peers. And for the most part, climate change is still considered to be an environmental issue. But yet the majority of Canadians don't see themselves as environmentalists. In fact, I think it's less than 8% of Canadians actually are associated with an environmental organization. So at scale, this looks like polarization. And in Canada, we consistently see support or that sense of the harm or the impacts of climate change kind of cleaving on political identity. So those people who sit on the more left-leaning sense of identity are more likely to believe that climate change is a serious problem. They're more likely to believe that they'll be impacted, whereas those people who sit on a right side of the spectrum are less likely. And that may be in part to, around how we're talking about the issue and who's talking about the issue. So in the media analysis, and I would encourage you to take a look at that as well, we took a look at national stories. And that was, part of the good news is that the media is, representing climate change or climate action positively. However, the majority of those stories still continue to be situated within a very technical, policy, and economic frame. So most of the stories that we're seeing nationally are very sterile, they're technocratic, and for the most part, they are meaningless for many people. And the people don't see themselves or as the type of person who can talk about this. So we know that, consistently, the kind of language that's being used, decarbonization, net zero, emissions, GHG, doesn't really mean a lot for most people who may be concerned about, how they're getting their kids to school, that kind of thing. In our daily lives, those words and the way that we're talking about it and how we're and who's talking about it is not really relevant for people. The other part of this is, the people who are telling the story. So in the analysis that we did, these are the top 10 people who were most often referenced or quoted in national stories about climate change. And what we can see here is that they're largely white male politicians, and no big surprise, but politicians are the least trusted, not even on climate change, but across a number of different issues. And more importantly, not represented here are the people who are most open to engagement. So people are not seeing, those people who are most open to supporting action are not necessarily represented in the stories that they're seeing. Those include women, those include BIPOC audiences, young people, new Canadians, etc. So this kind of polarization, the sterilization, the lack of understanding, the lack of sense that we can do anything about it consistently come up as the key barriers and obstacles to engagement. And so I'm going to now hand it over to Kara, who can talk about how we can address this.
Great, thank you, Amber. So we want to walk you through the message triangle. I think it's important to start off by just saying what we really want to do is simplify the narrative. We want to cut through the noise and connect to what people care about. And this is really about respecting where people are at. People have busy lives, a lot of competing interests and other things to worry about. And when that pathway to action isn't clear, it's easy to tune out on this issue. So in terms of the message triangle I mentioned that we've come up with, it has, of course, 3 components, as a triangle does. The challenge, so making clear what it is that we're facing. This can be positioned either as a great threat or an opportunity that we want that we're not able to quite grab yet. What is the pathway? Making the pathway on energy transition and climate action really clear. What is it we need to do over what timeline in really clear ways? And then what are the benefits of taking those steps? And just to mention, this does follow classic narrative structure where you have that tension point, something that people are trying to overcome. You have what is it that you can do, the choice that can be made, that pathway, and then what will get better if we take that action. So the triangle, we're going to walk through it, and just to say from the outset that it's specifically designed to address the barriers that Amber just laid out. You can start any point on this pathway. You can put out that, the vision, the benefits, like what is it we want? What is it we're hoping for? How do we get there? And then bring in the climate or energy transition imperative. The important thing is to keep in mind you want to be tailoring to the different folks you're trying to reach. We've designed this so it's really a high level framing tool to amplify key themes across your work and across different ways of messaging it. So moving ahead then into how do we actually use the message triangle to talk about the energy transition? So as Amber mentioned, Canadians are really ready for the conversation about a new energy economy and transition, but don't really understand what can be done. So in terms of articulating the challenge, there's a number of different ways to do that. One key thing though, moving ahead, is using plain, obvious language about the cause. So we're burning coal, oil, and gas. This is creating pollution, staying in the atmosphere for thousands of years and overheating the planet. To stop the problem, we have to stop polluting. It's important that we clarify that Canada is among the top 10 climate polluters in the world. One thing that's been so pervasive is that Canadians really think we're sort of ahead of the game. And if we were to do more, we'll be harming ourselves compared to what others are doing. But we have to actually break that myth. Emphasize the impacts are here. So this is coming in through the extreme weather gate that was mentioned is really rising in terms of concern. But what's really key is that this is personal, that we make it personal to people, how this is affecting their lives, their communities, how we're seeing it impact people that we care about. Another part of the challenge in this, depending again on your audience, can really be a good way to lead in. But, positioning the energy transition underway and that Canada risks being left behind if we don't get a plan together to move away from oil and gas and reduce our emissions from other sectors as well. So moving ahead to the next piece. So the challenge is critical, but keep in mind that triangle, it's like 1/3 challenge. The other two pieces are more on the positive side, like what can be done and what will be better when we take that action. And so it's really important that we think about that balance, because we can't leave people in that pessimism, that doom. We need to lead people to inspire new thinking about what's possible, and doing so by making real clear examples of the solutions that are here and steps that can be taken. And so what this looks like when we unpack the pathway piece of the triangle is really painting a simple picture of the overall pathway, avoiding the jargon that was referenced, net zero, decarbonization. We've got to get rid of climate pollution now, to keep ourselves safe. And the pathway is clear. The solutions are here, such as weatherproofing homes and buildings, electric vehicles, increasing transit, electrical grid improvements, renewable energy. Those real clear things that actually can deliver benefits to people in a number of ways. It's important that we position this as a crossroads moment. We need to cut half of the climate pollution over the next 8 years. There's no time to waste. And what we want to do is avoid terminology like we want a clean energy future, which punts that into a murky place without a clear destination. This is where we need to be going now. Now's the time. To name the who and what. How will the transition actually happen in a realistic way along a clear timeline? One thing we know, it's good to use clear language, like we need a plan for protecting workers versus just transition. Another part of the pathway is the need to keep Canadians safe from more intense and frequent extreme floods. And safe is a really important word here. That's something that really can resonate. And if we're emphasizing that element, though, to make sure that part of keeping people safe from these risks is reducing them in the first place by getting away from the source of the problem. We want a really clear ask. We want to ask elected official and candidates at all levels of government, what are your climate plans? What are your plans to move us along the path on this energy transition? What are your plans to protect oil and gas workers and others in this segment? What are your plans to protect Canadians and our communities, and demand that leadership be on the scale of what's needed? So moving to the third point of the triangle, sorry, folks, I have a bit of a cold. We want to make sure that we're honing in on the benefits and the ones that are most relevant, because you remember that barrier of irrelevance. So again, what will get better? What are the things that will come from taking these actions? For some audiences, that may be directly addressing climate change, if that is a key concern. For others, though, we have to come at it from a different angle. One thing that's really key, though, starting to unpack the benefits point of the triangle, is that we generate realistic hope, illustrating the ways in which this action generates outcomes that the folks you're trying to connect with care about. So safe from the impacts of a changing climate. There's a lot of concern out there about the mental health impacts. And so we can lean in here to the mental health benefits of addressing this issue, coming together to take on this great challenge. We can look at how electrification and other solutions, such as weatherizations, make things more affordable, comfortable, and convenient, increasing health and quality in life. So we can also tie to how taking steps now is going to make lives safer, more stable, and viable for future generations. Access to solutions is also important to talk about, making sure that we're promoting solutions that folks at different income levels can approach, young folks, old folks, BIPOC Canadians, really thinking again about tailoring that part of the story, but thinking about the solutions that are accessible. Also important to note that for some, protecting special places, activities, traditions, and ways of life is part of what can generate that sense of realistic hope. Making the economic case. So this is really key too, but this isn't just about the dollars and cents, because we know that people, the bottom line matters, but people care about more. And the economic case has more impact when it's also tied to people's values and the right thing to do. But some of what we can lean into here is the opportunity for building clean, renewable energy, for good paying jobs, stable jobs, local economic development, the cost effectiveness of renewable energy now, how EVs are becoming accessible thanks to operation costs and incentives that bring down the cost. Talking about world's energy systems are changing, that there's actually an opportunity for our energy sector to compete if we have a plan to move away from fossil fuels and protect our communities from impacts. Opportunities for young people to be part of the solution and have generational employment, more choice and efficiency in acting now versus waiting until the challenge gets worse. And then highlighting leadership and innovation. You know, again, like it's not about, it's just, we have to do it. We also do, one of the benefits is that we want to feel like we're doing something meaningful and creating a contribution. And there's something to be said for Canada's opportunity around being at the forefront of the clean energy sector by leveraging our ingenuity, experiences, and resources. And we know that Alberta, for example, is really becoming a key leader on renewable energy. So highlighting those opportunities and benefits. But there's also about Canada stepping up. We've stepped up for big challenges in the past, like addressing the ozone hole through the Montreal Protocol. We can do it again. So those are just the 3 elements, and I'm going to hand it over to Amber to share some more tips on how to use it.
Thanks, Kara. So really, there's kind of 2 main points here. One is around the who we're talking to, and also who's talking to them. And then I'd like to share a little bit about some of the specific message testing that we did, and share some of the results and the insights that came out of that. So, we referenced this before, but I think it's important, and it bears going back to, that we really need to start where people are. So we have a small portion of the Canadian public that is engaged on this issue. So that's the 25%, those are the alarm, and they're ready to have this conversation. Then we have the majority, which falls within this kind of passively concerned, or what we call as the movable middle. And that represents, or those people represent, about 45% of the population. They care, but yet they're not yet activated. And that is in part due to, some of the obstacles that we unpacked earlier. So for those folks, and we'll offer some more examples later on, but for the alarmed, they're ready to jump in to the conversation. For the movable middle, they're at the beginning. And so they're more likely to engage with more general topics like electric vehicles, or about protecting homes from extreme weather events. The other piece of this within that kind of movable middle is that it's not a monolith, and there are actually a lot of different segments within that. And I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but basically, women, and it's mounting evidence, not only here in Canada, but also in other countries, that shows that women are more concerned than men. And more importantly, they're much more likely to support climate action. Younger Canadians tend to be more supportive of climate action, and there's also some evidence that BIPOC and new Canadians are maybe as well. So that kind of movable middle, there are certain segments within that are more open, and that are, will have more results with less effort. And then the other part of this that I think bears repeating is around the messenger. So for many Canadians, 99% of the message is actually the messenger itself. They really have a strong influence on how people respond, given that we tend to trust people who look like us. And so when we can diversify the messengers that we have, people will become more open to having the conversation. People, really want to talk to people that they feel can authentically represent, or authentically talk to the things that they care about and that they're concerned about. Also worth repeating here, I think, is that people do trust scientists. There's a great Environics poll that came out recently, and as well as science organizations. So the next couple of slides are going to be a quick breeze through, so that we have some time for questions on the frames that we tested and the frames that seem to work within this kind of climate action, energy transition conversation. So just a little bit of background on this. We did this with the Climate Citizen Group, and we partnered with a number of organizations here in Canada. We ran Facebook ads under their brands, not to their audiences, but using their brands. And we actually tested with the alarmed, and we tested with the movable middle, and we tested in different communities around Canada. And so what I'll cover are kind of some of the key insights that came out of that. But again, I would encourage you to go and take a look at the deck and the report that came out of that. So in the message testing across the board, so for both audiences, we see that climate threats and solutions came out on top as the most engaging, followed by energy transition, and then followed by climate leadership after that. Worth noting that that kind of moral conversation, the one that we've tended to have for a long time, turned out to be the least engaging. And we used language, and we used messages that had tested really high in other campaigns. So there was a lot of evidence that came through, but nonetheless, even borrowing that language, borrowing that framing, it tested low. A couple of the other insights that came out of this project, I think that bear repeating, is that the frame mattered more than the message and the language. That said, I'm a big advocate for plain language, but overall, what we were talking about, that kind of frame, what we were orienting people to think about, was more important than the individual message itself. And then again, women were more likely to engage online in conversations, to comment, when we advertised only to them. So when men weren't a part of that space, they were also cheaper to reach and engage with than other segments. So then I think we've talked a lot about climate threats, and we've talked a lot about solutions, but just before I dig deeper into the energy transition and the climate leadership ones that we tested, I think it's worth saying that for climate threats, what we want to see here is personal storytelling, and that's animated. We want to have descriptions of local impacts, tangible examples of steps that people compare or rather can take to reduce their risks. So Kara covered quite a bit of that previously. And then the other piece that I wanted to mention with climate threats and solutions is that for the alarmed, they're quite ready for a nuanced conversation. So they'll be talking about topics that you aren't necessarily even within the ads. And then similarly for the solutions part, they will have quite a nuanced conversation around conservation or other types of environmental actions. So that kind of alarmed audience, because they're really much more farther ahead, are going to be having a more nuanced conversation. And so people who are advertising or communicating should be prepared for that. So the next two slides take a look at the kind of pieces that tested well. So overall, I would say that if you're talking about energy transition, and this came through as very engaging for both the movable middle and for the alarmed audiences, we want to talk about this still in plain language, right? So we're going to remove this elitism that seems to be creeping in. We're talking about cleaning the grid. We're talking about electrifying buildings. We're talking about electrifying our cars. We want to give tangible examples again, switching to electric buses, switching to heat pumps instead of gas furnaces, that kind of thing. And then what you'll see in this particular ad is pointing out the writing on the wall. So this particular ad, "We must move away from oil and gas," was received the most engagement from both audiences, and it wasn't polarizing for either. We didn't see more negative reactions or more positive from either group. So it was an unpolarizing message. And you can see there are different elements in here, right? So the need, the kind of stating the writing on the wall around the no need for investment, normalizing this. So 60% of Canadians believe we can't keep doing this. We need to cut, climate change emissions almost in half, et cetera. So there's more information in the deck, but just to say that this tested really high and it was not polarizing. Similarly, the other one that we tested was around needing a plan for oil and gas workers, also tested really positively with the movable middle. There was high engagement and high positive sentiment. This is the example of the copy that accompanied the ad. This kind of framing around the reality being that the oil sector will decline and that we need to prepare for it and that people are worried about it. It's a very personal kind of story. The other things that we might want to be talking about in terms of the kind of climate leadership piece, messaging that, so just to say, it's not what is on screen, but in terms of climate leadership, the messaging that Canada's falling behind other countries was engaging for both audiences, but it had mixed reactions. So for those in the movable middle, there was more pushback And the need for a fossil fuel treaty, we also tested that. It had high engagement, but also mixed reactions from the movable middle. So to go back, this kind of idea that we need to move away from fossil fuels was high engagement and not polarizing. And then for the movable middle, this idea that we need to support or have a plan for oil workers was also high engagement and high support. I'm going to move on to a couple of other things to consider. So we've been largely talking about energy transition and the focus of this webinar. That's not to say there aren't other conversations that are important and will be engaging for Canadians. But in order to allow ourselves some time for questions, these other topics are covered in the playbook that we'll be releasing. And we know that extreme weather is how people are making sense. We've offered some recommendations on how to have that conversation. High support for transitioning away from fossil fuels. We've recommended some ways to have that conversation. We know Canadians really hold fairness as a core value. We've offered some recommendations on that, as well as health, and then also the conversation that includes people's sensitivity and concern around affordability and money. So I'm going to pass it back over to you, Kara, just to have to wrap us up with some final tips, and then we'll move into questions.
Great, thank you so much. And thanks everyone for the questions that have been coming in. We're gonna just take a couple minutes here to wrap up the presentation, and then we'll turn to some of those that we haven't been able to answer typing, and just chat about them for the final bit of the webinar. So the last piece we just wanted to mention, we did the message testing. A lot of what is in this playbook that we'll be releasing is about how to have the conversation. And we know that's just one piece of it, that we really need to think about deeper engagement, finding the right frames, messengers, way to connect so that we're really overcoming those barriers that Amber talked about, the literacy, proximity, efficacy, and irrelevance barriers. So some of the ways to think about this then is the importance of not just talking at people, but really creating opportunities to be in conversation where it's as much about listening, but really leading with empathy. So again, recognizing people are at different stages of their understanding, acceptance, and activation on this issue, and typically for good reasons. So coming to it from that place of listening, wanting to understand where people are coming from so that you can connect, and really about building relationships. This is really critical too. And we know that people do feel isolated over this issue and want to come together with others to address it. We want to think about again, not just sort of broad communications, but opportunities where we can really activate trusted messengers through peer-to-peer outreach approaches to engage their social networks to raise awareness, but also spark action. Or dialogues where people have the opportunity in an unpolarized, safe context to really explore what is this challenge about, where they don't feel threatened because they're not an expert, not knowing the causes and drivers of this, where it can really be an opportunity to explore that pathway together. The importance of confronting false information in a very direct but not aggressive way. And again, tipping to some of those examples that were shared earlier of the energy transition emerging, the solutions being here, available, affordable. Using visual communications, we know this is just very important, whether you're operating the digital world, thinking about in-person engagement. This information can be really complex. So the more we're thinking of other ways to present it and provide opportunities for people to enter that. And just leading back to the point about listening, when we are thinking about engagement, just really trying to do testing, reach audiences, listen, engage with them, and then change approaches based on what we're finding with that, and to share also what we're learning with one another. And that's something that Climate Access, along with the Climate Narratives Initiative, aims to do. So I guess a final point here before we turn to questions that, again, we haven't been able to type answers to, is this is an ongoing process, right? It can take a while for people to move through the different stages of becoming aware and activated on this. We really need to keep at it in terms of building that groundswell of support and demand for action. And I think this goes back to some of the things I was seeing in the Q&A. You know, when you think about the alarm, that's 25% of the public. If that group was actually really activated, we'd be making great progress. That's a big chunk of people. And we know they're not. So we need to find those other ways into the conversation that people can feel comfortable and see themselves in and see themselves part of this action. So thank you, everyone, for joining. We're at the end of the presentation, but as I said, we'll turn to some of the questions in the Q&A, and I'm happy to jump in there, or if Amber, you've been able to pull up a few for us.
Yeah, well, we could start with some of the questions that we had that came in advance. This one is kind of a favorite. What would be your number one don't do where climate communications is concerned? Kara.
Why don't you throw that to Maria first?
I think that just one of them, the don't do's is don't kind of like, sorry, Kara. It's like, don't speak to the audience that you are like comfortable and familiar with, and don't necessarily like, don't be kind of like tone deaf to the situation that people are presented with. So it's like, you don't want to be kind of like holier than the other person, or, you know, mightier in speaking like above. Kara, can you like elaborate on this a little bit more? But
yeah, we talked about that a little bit, just how, you know, sometimes when you care so much about these issues, and if you're already kind of down the pathway of engaging, it could come across as self-righteous, you know, like I've got the answers or the solutions. So I think that's a big one. And I think related to that is a big challenge that you see, and this is often coming up in the media, but social media, just in general conversations, is the hypocrisy. So if you care about these issues, if you want action, but you still drive a car and you still fly to see your family for a holiday, that, you know, that hypocrisy, and it's often used as a way to kind of, you know, you even sharpen that polarization, that the people who care about this issue are really hypocrites. And I think one of the ways to overcome that is to really recognize, yeah, actually, I am still not living the kind of, you know, lifestyle I would like to either, and to focus back on the need for policy change to move us away from oil and gas, policy change to give us options so that the solutions are accessible and available, because we all want this, and it shouldn't be up to each of us individually to try and create this systems change, right? So we need to kind of put it back at the level that's needed. What about you, Amber?
Oh, I'm going to fall definitely hard on the techno policy speak. I think for the most people, you know, for most people, they have no idea what we're talking about. And the language that we're using has a big influence on that. It really functions to kind of separate the experts from the public. And people are experts in their lived experience. They are experts in how changes are actually going to be made in their communities and what changes are needed in their communities. So I think that there's a lot of value and work that we can do in just simplifying how we're talking about the issues, how we're talking about solutions for people, and really bringing people in and not creating to the confusion. So techno-policy speak is my number one on climate communications. I think that there are some other questions here. And I think one of the ones that
I've got one.
okay.
Yeah, it's a good one from Thea Silver. It's about just transition, the testing. It seems sometimes the environmental sector, what it considers the focus of just transition about oil workers and their communities is different and narrower than human and social justice equity organizations may define it, dealing more with housing, poverty, wealth transitions. Yet the latter often key trusted messengers we seek to engage. So I think this is actually really important because it just speaks to the point we made earlier about like trying to stay away from jargon, because trying to have, it's fine to use something like that, like just transition, but you actually do need to explain what you mean by it, right? Versus assuming understanding. And that term actually has a history coming out of the labor movement. So I think it has been grounded in that, but it has evolved over time. I think one thing that we've seen come up in research is that fairness actually works. It's just a clear term that resonates with Canadians. Like we want it actually to be fair as we're making these changes. And then again, like actually detail out fair in which ways do you mean and fair to whom. So I thought that was a really good one. But Amber, it sounds like you dug another one up too.
Well, an example of an elevator message, this came from Susan. We'll share through some examples that we've actually picked in a follow-up blog that do a good job of linking that the challenge to the pathway forward and the benefits. So Susan will provide some of those. The other one that I thought I could handle right away is there was a question around the moral argument and what does moral and interconnected mean. I apologize, that was kind of more shorthand for us in terms of testing, but by and large, what it meant is that people are ready for a more tangible, feasible, specific conversation. So kind of the broad sweeping conversations around this is the right thing to do, the kind of moral argument are important, but people are also wanting to have more conversation that is more nuanced and more about practical, tangible, feasible steps. What are the plans? What's the timeline? And I think that that's where communicators need to be prepared in terms of engaging with the public. They're ready to have that kind of conversation. People are concerned, that kind of moral concern piece is we're a little bit past that.
Okay, great. A question here from Anne Barron about people are trying to figure out how to incorporate changes into their own lifestyles and livelihood. What are resources available that could help a person in that way? And I wanted to pull this out because I think this is a really important piece about the pathway. So it's not just that Canadians don't get where we need to go as a whole. They also don't know their own role in that. Like, what is it I could do that is most impactful? And I don't necessarily think we make that easy for people either. And particularly for those who may not be compelled to join an advocacy campaign or organization, at least as like a first step, what are the other pathways? And so I think what's really important is that as we're thinking about where do we need to go as a whole, thinking back to who you're trying to engage and what is it they can do. And one of the things we know is people can get lost in individual behaviors and big long lists of things to do. So to put whatever that action is within the context of broader action. So, these are the biggest challenges we have in our community, and therefore these are the steps that you could take that would have the biggest impact, or even taking it up to a larger level in our province, in our country, and here are the things to do, and making those pathways really clear. I think it's also from an equity standpoint really important when we're trying to fill out that part of the story and guide people to resources on what they could do, is to think about no cost actions so that we're not tipping things to, oh, buy an EV and that's the big thing you need to do. Not everyone is in a position to buy a car. And so, yeah, just thinking about those different pathways for people that are meaningful. I think one thing that's really important is the more they're doing consumption-based inventories around emissions, the more we realize what we buy and what we eat matters actually a great deal. And so I think that's sort of another area that we could be leaning into more. Amber, any other you want to pull out?
Yeah, well, there was a question here. There's a couple. This entire webinar is a celebration of ecofeminism. And so that given that women are more likely to engage than men, who's the most important audience to engage with? And I think that there's kind of two parts to this. The easy part is women are more likely to support climate action. And there's so much work that we already know that just needs to be implemented. In part, I think we've realized that the top, the top kind of environmental organizations in Canada are largely led by women, but yet their voices are not represented in the conversation. So having, I think that women are important. I think providing spaces where women do not have to be engaged in a way that, they'll exit the conversation when it becomes overly polarized or overly opinionated. So providing spaces for women, focusing on women they're a very important audience in this. And we know that they support climate action more than men do. I'm not saying leave men out. I'm just saying that if you are going to, if you have a finite amount of resources, you're going to get more bang for your buck by trying to have this conversation with women than you are with men. So I think that that's really important. And then I think the other part about Messenger is really, I cannot overstate it, but messengers have to be of the community that you are talking with or that you're trying to communicate with. It's very important that we are cultivating more diversity in messengers and that they're of the community themselves. They will speak with much more authenticity, and a lot of the stuff that we struggle with is taken care of. Language is taken care of, when it's coded in a certain way. They'll be able to frame the conversation around what people really care about. They can talk about the practical and the feasible things that are happening within their communities with like more authenticity. So those are my tips.
Great. There are two questions that are related that I'm going to kind of bundle together before we wrap. And one is about when meeting elected officials, ministers, how does direct recommendations like stop all fossil fuel subsidies work, like really speaking truth to power? And then another saying we're in a climate emergency, not all climate policies are equal. There's a danger energy goes after things that make you feel good, but don't really make an impact. So how do we present climate policies in terms of how the emissions they will cut? So so I think that one of the things we found out from this work is that Canadians don't really like subsidies. And so that is something that you can lean into. And one of the things in the playbook you'll see is that Canada is actually top of the list when it comes to subsidizing oil and gas. And that is something to call out because those are our taxpayer dollars, where we're using them to basically fuel the problem that we're also taking great steps, and I'm very proud of as well, with carbon pricing and whatnot to address. So there's that conflict there that you can lean into. And I do think we have to be careful about it depends who you're talking to. Again, like with decision makers, like really holding them accountable for false solutions, right? If something isn't really going to push the needle in the way that we need to, then let's not kid ourselves. But when I think it comes to engaging other segments, you really have to start with where they're at and move up to the sort of more direct pieces once there's that trust established. I think in terms of how do you talk about climate policies and how much GHG, again, it's like not talking about it in terms of GHG, but it, here are the biggest things we can do to cut our climate pollution. And we know energy is a big one. We know transportation is a big one. We know our buildings are a big one. Agriculture, industry has a role as well. So really kind of laying that out. So we're almost at our time. Before I close us out, Maria or Amber, any final thoughts you want to add?
No, I'd be keen to let people get on with their day. And thank you so much for joining us. We will have the playbook available and we'll release that on the Climate Access website. The other piece is that we are offering a workshop with other communicators. So we've done a lot of talking next week, we're hosting a workshop where people will be in dialogue with each other. And we're going to do our best to pair people from different sectors together so that you can have more meaningful conversations. Currently, we've got quite a few people signed up for that, but we also have quite a few amazing comm strategists from across Canada who have also offered to help us host those conversations. So Maria's going to pop that workshop information into the chat, so hopefully you can join us.
Yes, great, and thank you. Thank you for, thank you, Maria. Thank you, Amber. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. You'll be getting a survey shortly about this session. We do appreciate you taking a couple minutes to fill that in. It helps us keep evolving and improving what we're doing to try and help you out there with your communication and engagement efforts. So thanks again. And thanks again to Joanna Leffler and the Clean Economy Fund, and hopefully see you next week at the workshop. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.